What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about Neonic's new $140 14mm carbon fiber wide body paddle, the Flare Prime X. This is probably one of the poppiest wide bodies I have used, but there's a lot to go over, so please consider subscribing if any of this is helpful, and let's just jump straight into things. Really quick, here are some of the specs on the screen, but otherwise I just want to jump straight into the gameplay. All right, starting off with power. So obviously this is a wide body, so they're just not really known for their power. It's just the way things are. That said, this is probably one of the strongest and poppiest wide bodies I have used. And again, it's all relative to wide bodies, but I honestly can't think of another wide body out there that hits as hard as this right now. Drives felt really solid, and unlike a lot of wide bodies out there, I felt like I could actually still be a threat with this with my power game instead of just kind of getting by like I usually do with these types of paddles. Drives, overheads, and volleys all felt like I could be pretty aggressive while using this. The paddle being 14mm made it feel abnormally whippy for a wide body too, which definitely helped in the power game even more. It's actually kind of a weird feeling when you can whip around a wide body like this. Now, the pop on the other hand was weird, but I suppose in a good way. To me, the pop on this actually felt pretty strong, like surprisingly strong. Like, this didn't feel like a wide body at all, which is both a good and a bad thing. I'm not gonna lie, I had one of the weirdest break-in periods with this paddle because for the life of me, when I started playing with this, I could not keep the ball in with this at all. I mean, there was a point where I felt like all my volleys and hits and drives would consistently keep going out of bounds no matter what I did. It was a very different feeling and experience. Besides just being bad, I'm very confident that this is also because of the wide body poppiness combination. Wide body paddles, at least for me, just play a little bit different in general because of the shape. For example, if I hit the ball on the edge of the wide body paddle, the angle will be affected a lot more than it would with something like a hybrid shape. And that, in combination with the more pop and power, meant that, at least to me, it was a little harder to direct that power consistently. I mean, it's not a bad thing, it just takes some time to get used to. That said, eventually after using it more and more, I did start to get a feel for it, and once I did, it became a lot more fun to use, especially when I actually started hitting the ball in. Now, a lot of people have been comparing this paddle to the Paddletech Bantam paddles, which I found specifically interesting because I've actually been using the Anna Lee Waters version as my main paddle for a while. And I gotta say, at least to me, these are not super similar. I suppose the power and pop on them are kind of close, but the overall feel between the two is very different. Both paddles are solid though, but the Paddletechs, at least the 14.3mm, are a lot more plush feeling, and the Flare Prime X is a bit stiffer. There's also the fact that one is a wide body and the other isn't, which is honestly the biggest difference between the two. It really just changes the complete feel of it and how it plays. But anyways, overall for power, I would give this a 7 out of 10, and for pop, I would give it a 7.5 out of 10. All right, now on to control. So this is where this paddle is a bit lacking in my opinion. So surprisingly, if you hit the sweet spot on this, even though it is a 14mm, it can feel fairly plush, but for the most part, this paddle feels pretty stiff. And it's that stiffiness and poppiness that makes it more challenging to play the control game with. This paddle definitely took longer to adjust to than most paddles I have used, and a part of me honestly thinks that it's me just because me and wide bodies don't mix super well, but I honestly think it's also still objectively just a bit more difficult and less forgiving than your average paddle. It just feels like when you hit the ball, you need to focus just a bit harder every time you go for a drop or reset. Kinks overall weren't too bad honestly, but still leaned a bit more on the difficult side. When I was using the Flare, I tended to randomly pop up balls sometimes, but a lot of it was just trying to get used to the shape and poppiness. But again, it did get a lot easier over time. But anyways, overall for control, I would give this a 4.5 out of 10. It's just slightly under average, but honestly, after you practice with it, it gets a lot easier to use. Okay, really quick, now let's go over spin. So honestly, nothing too special to say here. The grit on this is fine. It's pretty normal, and I'd say overall it has pretty average spin, so maybe even a bit over average. So I would give this probably a 6 out of 10. All right, now on to sweet spot. So the sweet spot on this is actually, as expected, pretty good. Like I mentioned earlier, if you hit the actual sweet spot with this, the ball feels pretty plush against it, and it feels pretty good to hit with too. That said, I think the specific sweet spot is actually a bit smaller on this, but I will say the really nice thing about this paddle is that even if you hit outside of that smaller sweet spot zone, the ball really never dies when you hit it. Like, I've hit around the edge a lot, and I never really hit it to the point where the ball just completely died after hitting it, which has happened with a lot of paddles that I've used. I mean, it didn't feel as great when you hit it on the edge, but the ball didn't die, so that's a win in itself. But overall, even though the sweet spot is a bit smaller, I think the more forgiving spot around the paddle is a bit bigger. So overall for sweet spot, I would give it an 8 out of 10. All right, on to my final thoughts with this paddle. So even though I rated the control on this a bit lower, this is still 100% a personal preference. For example, I have always just in general struggled to make make wide bodies work with my playstyle, but that is just me. On that note, then who do I think this paddle would actually be good for then? Well, obviously, if you like wide body paddles but want that extra power in your game, then this is 100% a paddle that you should check out. And like I said, even if you don't like wide bodies but just like poppy paddles in general, I still think it's worth considering. At the end of the day, I did eventually get a lot more comfortable with it, so if you are willing to put in the effort, it could definitely be worth it. I mean, having a hard-hitting wide body paddle is a pretty fun combination to play with. Plus, even more importantly, this paddle is pretty affordable. I mean, with my discount code, you can snag this for $126, which is actually really good for paddles these days. It's also worth mentioning that this is still a really well-built paddle too, especially for the price. Plus, the design on this is really nice and simplistic too, if you're into that. Plus, I think it's worth noting that Neonic actually released this paddle as the Flare Prime a while back, but then decided it wasn't powerful and poppy enough from what they were hoping for, and decided to redo it completely. And even though I'm not sponsored by them, I'm not sponsored by them, I do got to give them props because they really do seem to care about their products and quality. But anyways, hopefully this was helpful. Please consider subscribing if it was, and I will see you next time. Peace.